In the grand tapestry of Roman history, few threads shine as brilliantly, or as darkly, as the story of Emperor Caligula. His tale begins not in Rome, but in the military camps of Germania, where on August 31, 12 AD, a little boy named Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was born to one of Rome's most beloved generals, Germanicus, and his wife Agrippina the Elder. Nobody could have predicted that this child, born among the leather tents and gleaming shields of Rome's legions, would one day become one of history's most infamous rulers. The soldiers of his father's legions adored the small boy who toddled among their ranks wearing miniature military boots, caligae in Latin. It was these boots that earned him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boot. The name would stick with him throughout history, though he himself would later come to despise it. These early years shaped young Gaius in ways that would echo throughout his life, surrounding him with the power and pageantry of Rome's military might. But the happy days of his childhood wouldn't last. By the time he was 7, dark clouds had begun to gather over his family. His father Germanicus, beloved by the Roman people and considered by many to be the perfect choice for the next emperor, died under mysterious circumstances in Syria. Many believed he had been poisoned on the orders of the Emperor Tiberius, who some said feared Germanicus's popularity. This tragic event marked the beginning of a series of disasters that would befall Caligula's family. The years that followed were filled with sorrow and fear. Caligula watched as his mother Agrippina the Elder, who dared to challenge Emperor Tiberius, was exiled to a tiny island where she eventually starved to death. His 2 older brothers were arrested and died in custody under suspicious circumstances. His sister Drusilla was married off young for political purposes. Young Caligula learned early that in the world of Roman politics, family ties could be both a blessing and a curse. Yet somehow, the young prince survived. He was summoned to the island of Capri to live with Emperor Tiberius, a man many believed responsible for his family's destruction. Imagine the mental fortitude required of a teenager living in such circumstances, sharing a roof with the man who might have ordered the deaths of his parents and siblings, never knowing if he would be the next to disappear. Life on Capri was like walking on eggshells. The elderly Emperor Tiberius had turned the island into his personal kingdom, away from the politics and plots of Rome. Here, young Caligula learned to survive by becoming what others wanted him to be, charming when needed, submissive when required, always watching, always learning. He witnessed the workings of absolute power up close, seeing how an emperor could shape reality to his whims. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Caligula, now 24 years old, became emperor. The Roman people rejoiced at his accession. Here was the son of their beloved Germanicus, young, handsome, and untainted by the corruption that had marked Tiberius's later years. The Senate quickly confirmed him as emperor, and the Roman people celebrated in the streets. They believed a golden age was beginning. The first few months of Caligula's reign seemed to justify their hopes. He freed political prisoners, recalled exiles, and abolished the treason trials that had terrorized Rome's elite under Tiberius. He put on spectacular games and entertainments for the people, distributed generous bonuses to the army, and showed great respect to the Senate. He even published the empire's accounts, showing a transparency that was unprecedented. Modern historians often point to these early months as evidence that Caligula began his reign with good intentions. He seemed determined to be everything that Tiberius wasn't, generous instead of miserly, public instead of reclusive, merciful instead of cruel. The Roman people adored him, and coins from this period show him as a dignified young ruler, the very image of Roman virtue. But then something changed. Whether it was illness, hereditary mental instability, or the corrupting influence of absolute power, Caligula's behavior began to shift dramatically. In late 37 AD, he fell seriously ill. When he recovered, he seemed a different person. The charismatic young ruler who had won everyone's hearts began to show signs of the madness for which he would become infamous. One of the first signs of this transformation was his relationship with his sister Drusilla. Already unusually close, their relationship scandalized Roman society when Caligula declared her his heir and appeared to treat her as a wife, despite her being married to another man. When Drusilla died in 38 AD, Caligula was inconsolable. He declared her a goddess, the first time a Roman woman had been officially deified, and made it a capital crime to laugh, bathe, or dine with one's family while the period of mourning was in effect. After Drusilla's death, Caligula's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began to demand that he be treated as a living god, something that shocked Roman sensibilities. While Romans were familiar with the concept of deified emperors, this only happened after their death. Caligula insisted on divine honors while alive, even planning to install a golden statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem. His financial policies became equally bizarre. Having depleted the treasury with his initial generosity, he began to seek money through increasingly creative and cruel methods. He imposed new and unusual taxes, sold positions in the government to the highest bidder, and even turned part of the imperial palace into a brothel, staffing it with the wives of senators. The tales of his excesses grew more outrageous with each passing month. He was said to have made his horse, Incitatus, a priest and promised to make it a consul. He built a bridge of ships across the Bay of Baiae so he could ride across it, supposedly to prove wrong a prediction that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. He would appear in public dressed as various gods and goddesses, demanding instant recognition and worship. His cruelty became legendary. He would force parents to attend the executions of their children, always watching their faces to ensure they showed no signs of grief. He reportedly had people sawed in half for minor offenses, and when there weren't enough condemned criminals to feed to the wild beasts at the games, he would have spectators thrown into the arena instead. Yet it's important to note that many of these stories come from sources written after his death, particularly from historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, who wrote their accounts decades later. These writers had their own biases and agendas, and many historians today question how many of these tales are true and how many were propaganda meant to justify his assassination. What we can say with certainty is that Caligula's relationship with the Roman Senate deteriorated rapidly. He humiliated senators publicly, made them run alongside his chariot, and forced them to worship him as a god. He reportedly declared that he could have them all executed at any time, and frequently reminded them of this power. The once cordial relationship between emperor and senate had devolved into one of terror and resentment. His military adventures were equally problematic. He led an expedition to Germany, where his father had won such fame, but it amounted to little more than a parade. He then marched to the English Channel, reportedly planning to invade Britain, but instead ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war from Neptune. Whether this was meant as a humiliating punishment for the troops or was evidence of his deteriorating mental state remains debated by historians. By 41 AD, the situation had become untenable. Caligula's behavior was growing more erratic and dangerous by the day. The treasury was nearly empty, the Senate was terrorized, and the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, were increasingly concerned about his stability. A conspiracy formed, led by officers of the Praetorian Guard and including several senators who had suffered under his rule. On January 24, 41 AD, as Caligula was walking through an underground corridor in his palace, the conspirators struck. Led by Cassius Correa, a Praetorian Guard officer whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated, they stabbed the emperor multiple times. According to ancient sources, he died shouting "I still live," though like many details of his life and death, this may be more legend than fact. The aftermath of his assassination was chaos. The conspirators also killed his wife Caesonia, and their infant daughter, determined to wipe out his line. His uncle Claudius, who had been largely ignored as a potential threat due to his apparent physical disabilities, was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace and proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard, beginning a new chapter in Roman history. But the story of Caligula didn't end with his death. His brief reign left an indelible mark on Roman history and the popular imagination. The Senate ordered Damnatio Memoriae, the erasure of his memory, having his statues destroyed and his name struck from public records. Yet paradoxically, this attempt to forget him has made him one of the most remembered Roman emperors. The question that has fascinated historians for centuries is, what happened to transform the promising young ruler of 37 AD into the notorious madman of legend? Various theories have been proposed. Some suggest he suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, pointing to ancient descriptions of his seizures and insomnia. Others propose that he may have been poisoned with a substance that caused permanent brain damage, or that he suffered from a hereditary mental illness. Modern historians have also suggested that some of Caligula's seemingly mad actions may have had rational, if misguided, motivations. His humiliation of the Senate, for instance, might have been part of a conscious effort to reduce their power and move toward a more absolute monarchy. His demand to be worshipped as a god might have been an attempt to establish the kind of divine monarchy that existed in the East. His financial policies, while often cruel and arbitrary, might have been desperate attempts to replenish a treasury that had been depleted by his early generosity and the expensive building projects he undertook. Even the famous incident with his horse, Incitatus, might have been an elaborate joke meant to mock the Senate, suggesting that a horse could do their job just as well as they could. Yet even with these possible explanations, Caligula's reign remains a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power. His story raises uncomfortable questions about human nature and the institutions we create to govern ourselves. How can we prevent power from corrupting those who hold it? How can we structure our institutions to protect against the whims of unstable leaders? The Rome that Caligula ruled was already moving away from its republican roots toward an increasingly autocratic system. The powers of the emperor were poorly defined, limited more by tradition and practicality than by law. Caligula's reign demonstrated how dangerous this lack of formal constraints could be in the hands of someone who chose to push the boundaries of his power to their limits. His reign also highlighted the peculiar position of the Roman emperor, simultaneously the highest authority in the state and yet vulnerable to assassination by those closest to him. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect the emperor, became instead the instrument of his death, setting a precedent that would be repeated throughout Roman history. The impact of Caligula's reign extended far beyond his own time. His name became synonymous with tyranny and excess, a symbol of how power can corrupt and how quickly a promising leader can become a despot. His story has inspired countless books, plays, and films, each attempting to understand the enigma of his character and the nature of his supposed madness. In many ways, Caligula's reign marked a turning point in Roman history. The optimism that had accompanied the end of Tiberius's reign and the beginning of Caligula's was shattered, never to fully return. The Romans would continue to celebrate each new emperor's accession with hope, but there would always be the lingering memory of how quickly such hope could turn to terror. The physical traces of Caligula's reign are few. Most of his statues were destroyed after his death, his buildings were relegated to other emperors, and his coins were melted down. Yet his impact on Roman history and Western civilization has far outlasted any physical monuments he might have built. Today, archaeologists and historians continue to uncover new evidence about his reign, forcing us to re-evaluate the traditional picture of the mad emperor. Recent discoveries have shown that some of his building projects, far from being mere expressions of megalomania, were actually practical improvements to Rome's infrastructure. His harbor works at Rhegium and his attempt to build a new aqueduct for Rome suggest a ruler who, at least sometimes, was concerned with practical governance. Perhaps the most important lesson from Caligula's reign is about the nature of historical truth itself. Most of what we know about him comes from sources written by his enemies, years or decades after his death. These accounts might tell us more about how the Roman elite wanted to remember him than about who he really was. The real Caligula, the human being behind the legends, remains elusive. His story also serves as a reminder of the importance of institutional checks on power. The Roman system, which relied heavily on tradition, and the character of the emperor, proved inadequate when faced with a ruler who chose to ignore those traditions. This lesson would be learned and relearned throughout history, influencing political thought and the development of modern governmental systems. As we look back across the centuries at the figure of Caligula, we see not just a mad emperor, but a complex historical puzzle that continues to challenge our understanding. Was he truly insane, or merely a misunderstood autocrat? Was he a monster, or a victim of circumstance and propaganda? Perhaps he was all of these things, or none of them. What remains clear is that his brief reign marked a crucial moment in Roman history, when the possibilities and dangers of absolute power were laid bare for all to see. His story continues to fascinate us not just because of its sensational elements, but because it raises eternal questions about power, human nature, and the fine line between authority and tyranny. In the end, Caligula's life serves as a mirror in which we can examine our own relationship with power and authority. His reign, whether as historically reported or as transformed by legend, remains a powerful reminder of the importance of maintaining checks on political power and the potential for human nature to be corrupted by unlimited authority. As we close this examination of Caligula's life and reign, we're left with a complex portrait of a young man who began with promise and ended in tragedy, whose true nature remains debated to this day, and whose brief but dramatic reign would help shape the course of Roman history. His story continues to resonate across the centuries, reminding us that the questions he raised about power, leadership, and human nature remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago.